All right. Welcome to this webinar organized by Ksapa, Advise, Invest, Advocate. We're delighted to welcome an excellent set of panelists and contributors and continue to explore, as we've been doing across all of our webinars, the way private sector companies, investors can accelerate their contribution to the global goals. Just starting with a few but very useful practicalities, online meeting instructions. Of course, each of you is welcome to change name, but it's always better to know who you are, especially when you're using the chatting function because you're muted by default. And so the best if you want to share questions and comments is through the chat function. You may raise your hand as well. We've turned off the camera of everyone. That's a way to maximize the bandwidth and the quality of that discussion, as much as minimize a little bit the collective carbon footprint of this event. You can feel free to invite participants and colleagues, but those content will be uploaded as part of our .org and advocacy mission, because we're a mission-driven organization, on our website in our publication section. So you will be able to share the content with people if that's a way for them to improve on what they understand about the topic and how they can contribute more actively to the global goals. If you want to cover this event across your preferred social media, you can use and tag Ksapa.org as a way to make sure that we can track those discussions. And the list of registered participants is available on LinkedIn, mostly, not fully, but part of it. And that's a good way for you to network with others and benefit from those webinars and those digital discussions in this way. And a short poll is activated at the end. Just 3 questions, and thank you so much for answering those 3 questions. It's a way for us to improve the impact, the quality of those events, and make sure that next time you keep having an excellent experience engaging with us. Getting to the core of our discussion, walking the talk, empowering value chains to affect climate action. Just starting with the very limited words about this conversation that is happening at a moment when we are close to a +5 years when the Paris Agreement was signed, and at COVID-19 +1. If we look at when the COVID-19 crisis really started in China a year ago, and everything, a lot of things have changed or not changed enough. What has not changed enough is basically the way we are on track to meet with the Paris Agreement objective. It's not enough, much more must happen. And what has completely changed is that through the sanitary crisis that has been out there, a couple of investments and the way liquidities have been flagged as increasingly considered climate beyond the Paris Agreement as part of the solution. And that's promising to advance climate action for companies and their supply chains. Just the one who is speaking now is basically Farid Badash. I'm working for Ksapa. I will introduce you to our organization very briefly. My role here will be to moderate some of the conversations. And interestingly, I've been part of COP15 and I've been involved in COP21. And I've been able to see really the progress about the past 10 years of companies and investors committing to carbon. And I value how mature we are right now on those topics and why it's really an important moment in history, really a turning point where I'm really, I've seen where we were at COP15, and I really believe that a lot of maturity is there, a lot of tools are out there, and now a lot of action is happening as we speak, and we're pretty well positioned to see that, but much more must happen, and that's really why we want those discussions to happen, to ensure that you are all inspired and amplify the movement for climate action. Briefly about what we are, Ksapa is organized as a daughter organization, as I said. Our 3 pillars of activities on climate is really to lead some strategy work with Fortune 500 companies and with large investors to design climate strategies for them, but also to connect the dots between climate action and just transition. We believe it's really important because this is how we build acceptability of what companies and investors can do in the space. We also support companies as part of our consulting work to lead, for example, when we work with investors, decision trees to make decisions that are increasingly addressing the climate issues, but we're also able to embed those decision trees across system. And we have partners working with us, for example, playing with the data and activating the data for that to happen. But consulting is fine. It's good to give a direction, but it's not enough. Climate action asks for much more than that. So we actually have a second pillar at the core of our activities that is called the We Invest pillar, when we work with investors and companies to design, structure, and implement investment programs that are, of course, economically friendly, but which enable large companies to onboard the supply chains and federate some investors to deploy programs which scale up decarbonation and those issues. We'll come back to that later. It's part of the core of the discussion today. And because we're organized as a mission-driven organization, we have an advocacy role. All year long, we did some similar webinar discussions with our ecosystem, mostly of large company decision makers from around the globe and investors, large investors, equity companies. We issue regular report and briefing papers. Towards 2030, at the beginning of the year, has been really our roadmap that provides an overview of some of the big picture of where our ecosystem is moving forward. And we're really interested in how to tap into the potential of digital solutions and innovative financial tools to accelerate the movement of climate action, but not only. We also work on human rights, circular economy, and increasing growth. We just released a new report sharing some thoughts about what climate stress tests happening typically in France can mean for investors and where they invest. And we publish regular blogs exploring, among other things, for example, the role of board of directors to accelerate climate discussions. So all those resources are available and accessible on our website, on our publication section. Feel free to use those, and if that's helpful, to advance those agendas across your own ecosystems. We'll get to that as well, but Ksapa is organized really as an organization working across the globe with multiple partners. And we do this because we believe that whatever we want to do implies to think in a global manner, but also be locally relevant. Typically, when we're working on designing and structuring funds, we have the capacity to support understanding of local context from a legal perspective, accountancy perspective, and that's how we can advise, for example, on the design of green bonds and or on the putting in place some funds that can apply across multiple geographies. And it's pretty complex, and actually it's a challenge of today's time to advance and deploy at a large scale some solutions for carbon when some of our ecosystem basically have global operations, and that becomes even more. They are business partners and supply chains, and we're there really to work and crack really those challenges. I will move on, and I will hand over to Raphael. Also, then first to our first panelist, Ramiro, because we think that I've just made a brief introduction, but now when I say it's an important moment in history, when we talk about climate, I think it's very important to understand Race to Zero initiative and some of the expectations now as we speak. Call to action, Ramiro.
Thank you very much, Farid. Thanks, a pleasure to join you. Let me start with what you said at the beginning, that a lot of action, climate action, and the role of cities, business, and government and local governments has increased since COP21 in Paris, as you mentioned. And there is a lot of maturity today. An important part of that maturity, it is related to the decision of national governments to create a figure of high-level champions. Not too many people know about this figure, but their role, which is they're appointed by the COP presidencies, and their role is particularly to enhance ambition and accelerate action from non-state actors. So this is important because it was in Paris when national governments recognized and acknowledged that they definitely need the commitments and the climate action of all actors of society to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And they ask these high-level champions to help them to increase climate action at a global level. These champions are appointed by each COP president, and they have a 2-year term. So when the Chilean high-level champion took his role and working with the COP presidency, they knew from the very beginning, coming the new IPCC report, that the science was clear, and that if we want to have any chance to remain under 1.5 degrees, we need to be net zero by 2050 at the latest. And that's why we decided to launch the Climate Ambition Alliance, and that moved to the Race to Zero campaign that we have today. So I'm going to ask if you can put the slides on screen to see if it helps to the people. So briefly to explain to you, what is Race to Zero today? Race to Zero is this campaign, this umbrella campaign where all actors of society are committed to be net zero by 2050 at the latest. In the launch in the last year in the Climate Ambition Summit, you can see there we started with 66 countries, 10 regions, a little bit over 100 cities, and 93 businesses. All of them committed with our partners to be net zero by 2050. And a year after, in the New York Climate Week, a couple of months ago, the numbers that you can see there that we have, it is we doubled the number of countries that had an intention to be net zero, not all of them formalized it in structures. We had now over 500 universities that they also committed to be net zero. 22 regions, we doubled the number of regions of subnational governments, many of them in the US. We have over 450 cities now committing to be net zero, and a new initiative coming in place from C40, GCOMS, and other partners to have much more cities on the road to Glasgow. And business, we moved from 93 a year ago under the 1.5 pledge to over 1,100 companies committed to be net zero by 2050. And some of them, through the B Corp, committed to be net zero by 2030, or through a climate pledge to be net zero by 2040. So they have high ambitious commitments you can see there on the business sector. And investors, through the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, they were starting in September. I think it was 7 investors at that time. We got 45 investors today with over $5 trillion committed to be net zero by 2050, and they're working on that. And we know that there is an initiative of asset managers also coming and working on this. So we soon will have asset managers as well committed to be net zero. So as you can see, this Race to Zero campaign has grown substantially, even in the year of a global pandemic. So the recognition of commitments on climate, they didn't stop, but rather increased substantially. Just one element for you to understand, what does it mean? What does it require for a company or an investor to be part of Race to Zero? And I will ask to go to the next slide, please. You have to commit to 4 component structures, what we call the 4 Ps. You need to set up a pledge to be net zero in 2050 as the latest, hopefully before. You need to set up a plan with an interim target by 2030 as the latest, with a high level of ambition of that interim target by 2030. You need to take action to commit, to proceed and take action immediately. And finally, you need to commit to report, to make public the progress that you are making on climate action with an annual or a 2-year annual basis that can be reported. So this is the structure, and this is how we're working with the initiatives that are part of Race to Zero campaign to get these net zero commitments and engage all actors of society under the Race to Zero. And finally, next slide for you to know, to understand how this works. It is, as Secretary General said recently, we need to engage all actors of society on this race. And we are seeing there is a great gain in momentum, a lot of momentum going on net zero, and it's becoming the new parameter and the new standard for actors of society joining on this. As you saw recently in the case of Japan or South Korea, or now Colombia also committing to be net zero by 2050. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity, and 2021 is going to be, we will see a rapid acceleration of climate action all the way through. And hopefully Glasgow will be a very successful COP as well, as we had in Paris in COP21, as you said, Farid. So I will stop there and see how we go on with the questions and other elements that you want to consider.
Sure, we'll get back with questions. Just maybe one additional point of support. It's basically the access to the exponential roadmap report, which provides a good overview on some of what can be expected by companies and investors. It's just, I think, a practical tool, sort of, although it's pretty heavy in terms of content, and accessible on the internet easily. Exponential roadmap. Moving on, and Ramiro, you'll get it, of course, an opportunity to keep contributing slightly later on with our additional panelists coming in. And now, my pleasure to welcome actually also Raphael sharing his perspective. Raphael working with the Ksapa team.
Hello, everyone. Very glad to be here to share my insights with you. And so in a few words, I'm Raphael Hara, Managing Director of Ksapa, with whom we develop and organize investment schemes to progress on the SDG agenda. And before that, I had a financial background and almost 20 years of experience in investment and asset management, designing, structuring, and managing investment funds. I will be brief on the general figures that will confirm and comfort everything that Ramiro and Farid said. So, as reminded by them, climate action is a collective imperative, and of course it will be translated in considerable amounts of investments needed. Just for the European Union, we are talking about more than 300 billion euros per year to reach the target that was set at the end of the year by the European Commission of 55% decrease of GHG emissions compared to 1990. And more broadly, the step is very high. Globally, to not only in Europe, but in the world, we need $4 trillion of investment per year, which represents more or less 4% of the global GDP, which is quite tremendous. And it concerns all countries, OECD countries, as well as emerging or developing countries. Developing countries representing around 10% of this for $3.8 billion per year needs of investments. It concerns all economic sectors, all companies, and at all stages of maturities. And just as an example, it's estimated that venture capital needs into climate-related innovative companies will be growing 5 times faster than the average rate of the rest of the industry. Good news is that liquidities are tremendously available, and they are, let's say, this level is favored by very low interest rates set out by the central banks to avoid economic crashes after the Great Recession and after the COVID-19 recession. And I guess each player has to step up its action, but thinking organization by organization will clearly not be sufficient. And we need to organize things in a systemic approach. And I think Leila will comment on that, on the regulation and coordination of central banks and regulation activities. Of course, public policies have to play their role as well by using all levers at their disposal: tax incentives, modulation of corporate income tax, de-risk incentives, carbon pricing, organization of carbon finance schemes, or even access to public tenders, depending on the, let's say, transition trajectory companies. And another aspect is that we believe that a coalition of actors are totally unavoidable. And it means investors aligning to companies, which is a key to hedge against future disruptions and in terms of investment value, but also in cross-sectorial approaches and in value chains. We will come back to that a few moments later. And I think that Kim will give us very interesting insights on what HEM decided and what are they up to. In terms of financing sources to meet these global needs of $4 trillion per year, of course, it's quite classic, but we have public policies and which need total reconfiguration, which has started, for example, in Europe, where recovery plan included a third financing green bonds. And for private players, the drivers are both to set the ground for acceptability and value creation opportunities to design and build a livable future, with SBT, for example, driving this appreciation or assessment. And private players are also driven by risk assessment, and it's a very good way to channel investments through transparency and credibility with the taxonomy, for example, European taxonomy that will be in place in a few months. We can mention a few new instruments, example of instruments that have been recently developed or that are to appear. Of course, we have, for example, ESG performance-linked bonds, which means bonds or loans whose interests vary depending on energy transition trajectory. We can give the example of Enel bonds or Channel 2. There are new ways to organize investments, for example, local investments in renewable energy developments with developers, but also institutional investors and or local investors gathering to produce local renewable energy. We can think of blended finance solutions and especially new forms of public and private partnerships with mechanisms such as hurdles, pay for success, co-financing, de-risk, or for example, climate impact bonds that have not been implemented for the moment, but that will be tremendous, really a great instrument to channel the private resources to the energy transition. And also on the public side, maybe creation of new guarantees, new instruments of guarantees leaning on the green value of assets to be able to secure investments. So just a few examples of the key levels that we can use for businesses to boost energy transitions. I will not comment them because they are quite classic, but what we can say is that in these different levels, a few of them need investment and let's say significant investment amounts. And these levels are energy efficiency, renewable energy, of course, the research and development, eco-design of products, and circularity schemes also that will need investment quite significant, but that cannot be thought as only in an organization, as mentioned earlier, but rather in a value chain. An example of how we can imagine to mobilize a value chain is that in this example, we will present what is the input we could imagine in a scheme that we have developed and we promote at Ksapa, is to embark multinational companies on their 1.5 trajectories and to embark them not only these industrial companies, but also their ecosystem of suppliers, their joint ventures, and to organize, let's say, a systemic approach for the whole value chain. So it's based on the three, there are three hindrances. It's time, expertise, and money that keep generally companies from activating energy transition investments. So it's very important to gather all the expertise needed in a replicable scheme to act globally on the value chain. So this expertise are of three kinds. Technical, to identify and implement energy efficiency solutions, and also develop adapted renewable energy schemes. You also need legal expertise to analyze how you can lean on assets, corporate profile, guarantees such as pledge or mortgage, and define what is specific to companies' activities or what can be organized with the help of external investors or with the landlord when companies are tenants of their properties. And of course, you need also a financial analysis on the P&L impact on the asset valuation on what you can imagine to implement as solutions for the energy transition. And when you use these three filters, it gives you a global transition plan with recommendation, and it's possible through different financial levels to organize the financing not only for one supplier or for one company, but more globally with partnerships for a global value chain. Partnership with banks, partnership with energy efficiency experts, partnership with renewable energy developers, and using all kinds of financial levers, short term, when you can imagine to use reverse factoring or supply chain finance, B2B loans to avoid that a supplier of a large group needs too much equity to invest in the energy transition schemes, bank partners, and also to drive external investors into transition investment funds that would bear directly or through SPVs, special purpose vehicles, the investment needed to develop renewable energy. Thanks a lot for listening. Leila, I guess you could share some complementary insights, especially on the regulation part.
Right. Can you hear me all?
Very well.
Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to take part in this conversation today. So yes, my name is Leila Kamdem, and I am a partner at Mazars in our financial services practice. And I'm based in our London office, and I lead our sustainable finance and climate change practice here. So I think, I mean, being one important thing to say to start with is obviously the role of financial regulation is absolutely fundamental if the financial industry is to support the transition to net zero. And being based in the UK, I've had the opportunity to witness firsthand the emergence of climate risk regulation. As you know, it all started with Mark Carney, then Governor of the Bank of England, and his now famous speech on the tragedy of the horizon in 2015. And so as we saw the momentum build on climate in the UK, at Mazars, we wanted to explore the topic a little bit further. And we work with the central bank think tank called UMFIF. And we did a survey of central banks around the world. And if we move on to the next slide, the objective for the survey was to understand the extent to which the momentum was also building globally on climate regulation and to identify any global trends. So we spoke to 33 central banks across 6 regions of the world. And some of our key findings are here on the slide. So first of all, a majority of 70% of central banks see climate change as a major threat to financial stability. And the survey was done back in Q4 2019. I'm pretty sure that this figure would be even higher now with the experience of COVID, because unfortunately, I think what COVID has done is it has really brought home the realization that sustainability risks can develop very quickly and completely disrupt our economies. If you move on to the next slide, so despite the fact that most central banks see climate risk as a serious threat, 59% of central banks do not currently supervise climate risk management. However, most central banks are working on future supervisory actions. And to take an example, in 2019, the Bank of England was the first financial regulator in the world to set out its expectations on climate. And by 2021, all UK financial institutions will need to embed climate into their governance, their risk management arrangements. They will need to quantify the level of climate risk exposures on their balance sheets, and they will need to disclose that information publicly. Moving on to the next slide on stress testing. So currently, only a minority of central banks, 15%, include climate in stress testing, but the direction of travel is very clear. A vast majority of 79% of central banks intend to run climate stress tests in the future. And here we can mention the Bank of England again, but not only. We also have the Banque de France and the ECB, who are leading the game on this. And the fourth and last finding on the next slide is about the role that financial regulators could play very directly in terms of incentivizing green finance. So this is about setting a green supporting factor or a brown penalizing factor, which basically means reducing capital requirements for green assets or increasing capital requirements for carbon intensive assets. Only 13% of central banks in the survey were in favor of each of the supporting and penalizing factors. So today, most central banks are reluctant to these measures because basically it has not been, we don't have enough evidence currently to demonstrate the fact that simply because an asset is green, then it is also less risky from a financial point of view. I think in some instances we can actually say it's the contrary. But the EBA is working on this, and by 2025 we should have a European position on this question. So just to finish, and going back to the question we asked ourselves at Mazars when we launched the survey, the momentum is clearly building on climate regulation, not just in the UK, but around the world. Climate stress testing and climate disclosures are rapidly becoming mainstream. And this is a very welcome development because ultimately it will allow capital to flow and to be redirected to sustainable activities. So thank you very much for listening, and very happy to take questions later on.
Thanks a lot, Leila. Now I think we should hear Kim maybe a few words saying that considering the risk approach, what you mentioned about the fact that financial risk must be clearly distinct. It's also the position of the insurance regulation authorities in Europe. So it will be we will set the ground for future debates that will be quite fundamental, as you said, for climate transition. Kim, I think that you have large ambitions and very advanced plans on the climate transition of your supply chains. And we would
thank you for having me. I think it will be difficult to go through the level of ambition in 5 minutes, but I'll try to give a quick overview at least. Will I click here, or how will this work? Farida?
Yes, there is no slide, so you need to speak up, I guess.
Okay, So the 3 slides I sent you is not included. Okay. Well, then I can just go through them in general. We have performed according to the TCFD regulations, we have performed a risk assessment for the H&M group, and we found mainly 4 different areas. The first one being increased prices of raw material. Of course, we used a lot of cotton, and cotton is a greedy crop, and will take a lot of damage from the increased temperatures. The second one is production disturbances, having difficulties with suppliers, or having difficulties finding staff to work in the factories if it's just getting too warm, as we see in more and more locations right now. Third one being distribution disturbances. We have a quite sensitive distribution network with a few big hubs that are sensitive from a climate perspective, especially sea level rise perspective. And then the fourth one, which we have defined, is of course the customer changing attitudes and purchasing patterns, which is not the smallest one, of course, but it's a very challenging one, talking about when it will happen. When it comes to our ambitions, it's really about the pace. We need to align our emissions to the carbon law, which means that we need to halve our emissions every decade. This is a massive task for us. We don't know really how to do that today. We have a long-term goal of becoming climate positive no later than 2040, and that is based on, first of all, decreasing our emissions in 50%, so that we are aligned to the carbon law or science, so that we can claim that we're doing our part of the problem. And then from there, we will do even more with the different types of compensatory activities. The main challenges that we see in these activities, or in our long-term ambitions, is that much of the decisions that are being taken is based on estimates and calculations, and, to be honest, sometimes guesses. So there's an extreme need for data, for improvement of data, better quality data, more granular data, data on everything, on every single part of our supply chain, especially. Yeah, so because right now we are basing our decisions on unsecure data, which is a little bit scary, but we also know that we cannot wait, because we don't have time to wait. So it doesn't matter. Whatever we do is better than waiting, and for better numbers. Second one, which has been mentioned previously in this presentation, is of course, how do we finance our supply chain? How do we make sure that money is available to the suppliers so that they can do the investments? How do we support them to do the right investments? How do we support them to do the right priorities when it comes to energy efficiency, type of renewable energy, and those type of questions. Is it direct investments, indirect investments? Is it bank guarantees? Is it incentives on bigger orders? I mean, it's probably a combination of them all. But yeah, so that's one big thing. And then when we now start looking at business cases on actual projects to get this really off the ground, we have difficulties of prioritizing. It's difficult for us to know where do we start, with what do we start, what technology, what country do we prioritize, and so on. Limitations also in government's policies is of course a constant overarching challenge when you are sourcing from countries that are going the wrong way, so to speak, from a policy perspective. So our focus areas going forward is really to put a lot of effort and resources and money into improve our ability to improve our ability to measure, data management in all types and different ways, and then of course create innovative financing models and methods together with regional banks, national banks, and central support from Stockholm, and just setting up a number of different ways of helping our suppliers with their financing. It's definitely not any silver bullets that is handed out. It has to be very local and almost down to facility level when it comes to the best solution for them. And when it comes to this priorities challenge, we are building a classic abatement curve, looking at what type of investments are going to give us the best value for money, so to speak, where we can look at cost per ton of CO2 reduction, so that we don't start off in the wrong area of our journey, so to speak. We're also, of course, aware that we need to start basically everywhere at some point, but we need to prioritize correctly. And then we also need to increase, together with our competitors and together with other companies in other industries that has the same ambition level as us, we need to increase the policy affairs locally in our sourcing countries and really support the local organizations to be much more vocal. And we also need to be on an EU level and support the politicians to take the right decisions, abolishing coal and other fossil fuel as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, excellent. Moving on then, and I will ask actually Ramiro, because it's been speaking a long time ago in this webinar, to potentially share, as we're moving on more in a conversation together, more of a perspective on the maybe question number one, listening closely to the contributions of in order Rafael, Leila, and then Kim, those questions of converging a regulatory environment which are conducive to drive liquidities to ensure that actually through energy transition, we're talking about really accelerating decarbonation. At the end of the day, it's connected. What's your perspective there, Ramiro, when you see, well, COP26 on its way and the way we can expect convergence, ensuring that to address some of the challenges expressed by H&M and Kim, we can expect to have greater convergence across regulatory environment, incentives, and potentially even data?
Yes, sure, happy to add there. And just to reaffirm that, as Leila and Kim said, it's indispensable, to have the right regulatory framework in place that can accelerate this transition, and that's part of the role and the vision that you have when you have companies and cities and investors committing to climate action. They are also creating sort of a positive pressure for national governments to put the policies in place that allow them to accelerate their own actions. This is what we call on the high-level champions the ambition loop. And the theory of change here, it is that if non-state actors commit to take climate action, they put a positive pressure on national government, that they set up new policy frameworks that at the same time, they enable non-state actors to to accelerate their actions and make more ambitious commitments and creating this positive synergy. And we just seen this in Japan happening in the last 2 months. It was the commitment to net zero by cities and companies that enabled the new prime minister, when he came in place, to commit the Japanese government to be net zero by 2050 under the parliament. And now we are seeing the financial mechanisms and the financial incentives that the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment are putting in place to allow these local governments to achieve their targets to be net zero. So this is the retrofitting system that you see everywhere going on. And this is the type of right partnerships and ecosystems that we need to create. So as Kim said, the advocate role of companies to the national governments and entities to ensure we have these right regulatory systems in place, it is critical, it is very important, it has a critical role to play there. And just a final comment there, because Leila mentioned Mark Carney and the impact that it had, his role in the Central Bank of England. I'm sure you are aware today Mark Carney has been appointed as Special Envoy on Climate Finance by the UN Secretary General, and we're working very close with him and his team. So I'm quite sure you will see a set of different regulatory systems coming in place and financial incentives and mechanisms on the road to Glasgow for the next 12 months. And there's a lot of work underway going on for Glasgow, particularly on finance.
Great, and it's clear that we've seen, I remember, as I mentioned with COP15, too much of the business were not really ready, and a big difference with COP21 was that moment was a growing number. We're asking for carbon and climate to become really a consistent rule that could apply across industries to be a level playing field. Now, it's really the moment when if cities, businesses, investors are all asking at the end of the day for similar convergence, this is all actually, yes, some policymakers will make a change, understanding that it's part of the solution and not part of the problem. Moving on, Leila, to give you actually also a perspective, maybe and addressing and moving on for industry leaders to be incentivized to become what we call you trailblazers. So at the end of the day, to measure and take the right level of risk, to invest in what we believe to be part of their competitiveness, but at the same time, part of what you say is that some of the regulations are still moving, so it's not easy to make decisions. You might believe that climate is really part of what you want to do, but it needs still to be secured in terms of the kind of risk that you're taking. So any idea or recipe of what might make industry leaders incentivized in that moving environment?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts when you look at climate regulation currently. The pace of change is really accelerating. I think there's two elements. The first one, I think maybe the most important one is you shouldn't, as a business leader, you should really not let perfectionism get in the way of this. We know we have to take action. There's no other option. The status quo is not an option. So we need to start somewhere. And I think Kim mentioned that about the challenge around data. Even though we know that data isn't at the right level in terms of quality, it's not true just for industries. It's true for, I mean, across all industries, including the financial industry. We still need to start, and we know that by starting, we are kicking off a virtuous circle of continuous improvement. So I would definitely urge business leaders to start with what you have, with the amount of data that you have, with the skills that you have available within your companies. And obviously it's going to improve over time. But if you don't start, it's not going, there's no chance, to improve if you don't start at some point. So that's the first point I wanted to make. In terms of moving parts, I think there's something very positive that is happening, and I'm going to link to the word you used before when you asked Ramiro the previous question. It's convergence. if you look at 2015, when Mark Carney did that famous speech on the tragedy of the horizon, and fast forward to now, what has changed between then and now is we do have a movement in terms of convergence and harmonization at the international level. There's still a lot of work to do, but the movement is there. We have the network for greening the financial system. That's a network of central banks and regulators across the world. And I think when it started, maybe 3 years ago, there was like maybe, I don't know, 8 central banks that were members of the network. Currently, we're probably around 70, I think, top of my head. Shouldn't be very far from that, which is huge. So you do have central bankers and financial regulators working together to move this agenda forward. And obviously, with the US election results, now the Fed has applied to join the club. So it's all very positive. I think it's going in the right direction. It is challenging, but you just need to start somewhere with what you have. That's the short answer to your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Leila. Maybe a third question. It's the question of how to organize ecosystems and coalitions so that risk exposure is, let's say, risk exposure and also possible benefits of investments in energy transition are well balanced among these ecosystems. We gave the example, for example, of a supplier in a large value chain investing in its energy transition. Of course, what the energy efficiency devices that are very specific to its activities will be something that it will have to deal with between its bank and its clients, for example. But investment in renewable energy would be very much more attractive for external investors because it's investments that have a value of their own and that can be liquid. So it's very, it's much easier to drive the interest of institutional investors in that kind of investments, for example. And Kim, we wanted to ask you this question because also I think that you mentioned earlier in our preliminary discussion that the way energy transition investments are accounted and acknowledged by SBT, for example, is a major hindrance of how to make the funds that are allocated to supply chain and energy transition really long-lasting. How do you feel about that and about this sub-question?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. If it's long-lasting, from which perspective?
Yeah, I think when we discussed earlier, you mentioned that as an example of the difficulty to share risk in the ecosystem, the fact that investing in energy transition investments for your suppliers where you represent, for example, 10% of their turnover.
Yeah, okay.
So will only induce that you get 10% of the
right.
Of this investment.
No, yeah, exactly. I think it's not a unique problem for us or company, but I think it's like a little bit catch-22 now when everybody is waiting for others to take the first step, kind of. And I think the ability we have of accounting for our investments are quite limited. I know that there are updates being done, but in general, it's more like if we decide to focus on one single factory, which might have the biggest impact short term, or the biggest impact from a CO2 perspective. But let's say that we maybe only purchase 1% from that factory's total production. But if we invest so that they get rid of 100% of their CO2 emissions, we still only get the 1%. We only get to account for the 1% from a climate perspective. And I think that really slows down the investment, because then everybody's, looking for a fair deal, kind of, instead of just starting to pour the money in. Everybody wants to have like super clear shares everywhere, and tries to from different in different ways make sure that you get your cut, kind of. So I think it's a negative. It's a big blocker, and it's also gives a negative mindset in a time where we need to collaborate. We need to not compete within this area. It needs to be just fully collaboration and not competition. So I think it needs to be fixed quickly somehow.
Yes, exactly. The rules need to be redesigned and reconfigured so that this shared
maybe a balance system or something like that, so that you can, it doesn't really matter where you get rid of emissions, as long as you get rid of them. I mean, the planet doesn't care if emissions disappear in one area or another. But I'm not sitting with answers here. This is a very complex question. I'm just saying that it's definitely a blocker right now for finding good investments from a reduction perspective. I mean, do we go with the factory that has the dirtiest production and make the biggest cut for the planet, or do we go with a much cleaner factory that maybe we have 100% purchases from, so that we can account everything? That was an example to clarify.
Yeah, it's a very good example of how the rules need to be redefined to drive this interest, and even when you have secured the funds, you need to be able to share in a balanced way the benefits of the investments, not only the risks.
Yeah, and I think it's quite generic in our industry that brands do not purchase 100% from factories. We have some factories where we do that, but in normal we have very small percentages. That's for safety reasons, both for us and the factory. We don't want to be too big in a specific supplier. Excellent. Maybe that's different in other industries. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I need to move on to make sure that we stick on time to some closing remarks. And there's been so much about convergence, and I'm just curious to walk through each of you as a contributor for just a brief closing remark. And we'll start with Ramiro with one very simple question, and others can get ready for that quick closing question. Something that you've heard from others today that is kind of feeding your own agenda, and where you want to move forward your activities on this race to zero.
Absolutely. I will reinforce Leila's message that even if we don't have all the data in place and all the mechanisms and systems to report, monitor, and address emissions and the climate threats as we have, we must take action as soon as possible. We need to acknowledge the level of urgency that we have. And that's why we set up this campaign as a race to zero. So I would like to encourage all members of the audience to join the race to zero, either through the 1.5 pledge, to the asset owners Net Zero Alliance, or the SME Climate Hub, any of the partners that we have on the race to zero campaign. But I think it is critical that we understand that we reach Glasgow with a massive members of society committed and working on their plans and their actions to net zero by 2050 as the latest. That would be my final message. Thanks.
Excellent and exciting. Moving to Leila.
Yes.
Remark.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think I'm going to take away what Kim said. the planet doesn't care, who is making the positive impact and who is going to benefit from it, as long as we are doing something positive. And I think particularly for the financial industry, because of the complexity of the challenge and what it means in terms of modeling and getting the data, there's a risk that financial institutions try to keep the innovation in that space for them and not share with the rest of the industry. But I think in the interest of the planet and humanity as a whole, there is definitely a case there for collaboration within the industry, sharing the knowledge that they have gained, the innovative techniques that they have put in place to measure risks and identify opportunities as well. So yeah, that's my final word.
Excellent. And I'd say, when Raphael shared also the slide with how we are structuring those new approaches to address some of those questions, I think being myself part of a lot of collaborations, and I know the limitation of some existing collaborations in the space here. What's needed is really collaborations with people coming with a strong financial and climate education to really understand and connect also some what's needed from a data perspective to converge on data, on the right innovative financial tools, and make sure that the ecosystem that is put together in the collaborative platform are able to really activate, prioritize what's needed for this ecosystem. And that might imply some peer companies, large buyers working together with some peer business partners, maybe the dirtiest to build on a challenge or comment made by Kim. Maybe not, but at least those are some of the ingredients in terms of competencies clearly needed for this new generation of platform, at least from a business perspective. Of course, I forgot something that is very important is clearly the understanding of the converging regulations and policies that can frame risk understanding for the years to come. Kim, closing remark as well.
Yeah, I just would like to highlight the urgency of finding collaboration and taking the opportunity to reach out to your competitors, bigger, smaller companies, and just try to find good projects to get started, to get rolling, try something, share the risk, accept a failure, and try again.
Excellent. Really what I guess a lot of business and investors need to hear. Raphael, maybe a comment from what you heard today?
Yeah, I would take away maybe the same thing as Kim, and is that the fact that coalitions are absolutely necessary to build and design new schemes to embark all organizations on the race to zero necessity. And I guess that to do that, we need to recognize that it's complex, but that by gathering people who can talk the same language as investors or as companies, we can certainly organize sound principles and based on mastered techniques, organize investment schemes so that we can really finance this energy transition.
All right. And it's time to make sure that we stick to the format here. So just closing and to thank you all and asking you to stay appraised of new and upcoming activities. Of course, many content are available on our website on the publication section. I mentioned one climate test stress briefing paper. Among many things, I think it's good to have a sense on the numbers with which central banks in Europe are actually playing right now. In terms of what they envision the cost of carbon to be in a couple of years from now. It's converging in a way to stress the urgency to decarbonize. But beyond that, you can see displayed on the screen some upcoming webinars, and you can register across LinkedIn and Eventbrite and our website directly at Ksapa.org in the event and webinar section. Thanks so much for taking part in this webinar, which is going to be uploaded on our website. And you can follow us on LinkedIn, notably on Twitter, Ksapa.org, to keep abreast of some of our additional initiatives coming on. closing word from myself, Farid, is just to thank so much panelists today and participants who joined today, and those who will continue to listen and learn and get inspiration, hopefully, from this discussion through the podcast and the video version of it. Thanks so much, and I will close the discussion now. Have an excellent day and evening, depending on where you're connecting to this discussion.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for the invitation. Pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much.